Hi there, thanks for coming back. My name is Norm Fenema, and today we are doing the Pacific War in our series on World War II. Okay, so Pacific War, and clearly it is Pearl Harbor that finally breaks American isolationism. Now, there have been some waning sentiment already in that direction, but this was a definitive invitation, if ever there was one, to join the war. So much so that it led to conspiracy theories that Franklin Delano Roosevelt knew about it in advance because he's predisposed to war more than Americans are, doesn't believe in the fireproof house thing. But so they knew about it ahead of time, him and leadership of America, but they allowed or even provoked the strike to force America's entry. So that's the back door to war theory, which is pretty much debunked and nonsense. But few points about it though that make it seem so compelling because yeah, it does hand Winston Churchill, certainly the British, what they in particular need and want, and what the administration is heading towards, right? But for Churchill, it also presents this real challenge because all Americans want to do at this point, any red-blooded American, is to make Japan pay, right? And to head in that direction. So Churchill now has to convince the American leadership that the real front is in Europe. So he's had a heck of a time of it trying to convince them to get into the war. Now it is to convince them, now that they're in, that Europe is the most important is the most important theater. So a Europe first strategy, as it's called, that is necessary to end the war. Basically, the premise there is that even if Japan is defeated, the war will continue, but if Hitler is defeated, it will end. Okay, so anyway, it works, and ultimately the Pacific War is less than half of American total involvement in the overall war, but also pretty brutal in ways that are seldom experienced in Europe. Okay, 2 million U.S. troops fought in the Pacific with 110,000 deaths. Now, Europe is about 2.4 million troops and about 160,000 deaths, but so it's not totally out of par with that. But unlike the European front, there's a really severe concentration of losses in frontline combat, especially in amphibious assaults, and that's something unique to the Pacific War, and that's because the high body counts there, because the Japanese are tenacious. Right? They have a no surrender philosophy, so they tend to fight to the death even when any chance of gain is long gone, which really infuriates Americans and explains a lot of the racism in America at the time towards the Japanese. It also explains these really lopsided death counts generally in favor of the Americans, but with a lot of American deaths as well. A good example of that is the island of Biak. Okay, here you have about 12,000 men on both sides. You end up with 3 months of fighting. In the small island in what is now Indonesia, then was New Guinea. Okay? 4,700 Japanese are killed here to about 430 Americans, so it's a 10-to-1 ratio. Tarawa, in some ways the same, another example. This is a very tiny atoll, and here you have a 2-day battle with a very tough resistance by the Japanese who are dug in here. And there's absolutely no height of land, right? So there's no way to have a surprise assault on one of these little atolls. So the 2,600 Japanese who are dug in here managed to kill 1,700 Americans. Real shock to the Americans. But all 2,600 Japanese defenders are wiped out, with only 17 being captured at the end, which is just incredible. Now, this is on an island that is only 12 square miles, okay, which also means that there's a lot of dubious command decisions on what island to take, okay? Now, first, before I go back to that, I have to say that I'm talking a lot about Americans, but it's not just Americans that fought in the Pacific. So did Australians. About 10,000 Australians give their lives in this theater, and the Chinese. That's really where it begins, and they lose millions. The British as well are involved, and a handful of Canadians. About 500 Canadians die in the Pacific, and they are used in. The Royal Canadian Air Force is used in quite a few battles here. Anyway, or in several. Anyway, American involvement dwarfs all of those. And this really is America's theater, where they have then a free hand in the decision making, unlike in Europe, where they're constrained by the other allies. So here you really see the American way of war. But as we'll see, that doesn't mean consensus on the best strategy. just as there's division in Europe, and here there's division between the Army and Navy. And that's interesting because it mirrors what is an even bigger phenomenon in Japan, a major gulf between the thinking of the Navy and the Army. But we have that on the American side as well, and that's one of the other themes in this war, or theater. Anyway, before we go any further, I just want to introduce you to some overview docs on the Pacific War that I think you'll enjoy. And if you're a visual learner, which all of us are, the term is kind of overused. Anyway, World War II in color, pretty good one, part 11 there. A World at War, the Laurence Olivier series, which is just fantastic, episode 23. And there's another one for you there. Now, in terms of historiography, there's a massive historiography on the Pacific campaign, as you would expect. A couple big names there, Richard B. Frank, the end of the Imperial Japanese Empire. John Dower, who really introduced the idea of the importance of race and understanding everything going on here. Richard Overy, who's written many, many books on World War II. There's one by him in 2021. And then a really important name here is Ikuhiko Hata, who ended up in a libel trial or anti-censorship trials in Japan for what he was saying about the war. And he's got books going back to 1968 and then more recent ones. There's a few other names at the bottom there. Sadeo Asada is one I might have added. He's another Japanese voice that does a lot, especially on the atomic bombings. Okay, so there's your reading list. Okay, and before we go further, and in keeping with bottom-up history, before we go high level, I want to give you a story of one family's experience in this front of the war. Okay, and that starts with a boy born in Guangzhou, China. And he was a Chinese opera singer who ends up, he's born in 1901. He moves to Hong Kong, then a British colony, in these troubled years of the waning years, really, of the troubled Qing or Manchu dynasty. In Hong Kong, he becomes an opera singer and a film actor. His fortunes go up a lot when he marries his Chinese wife, who's also of mixed European heritage. And it's a big step up because she's a wealthy socialite. They end up having 2 daughters and 3 sons. Now, he becomes famous enough that he ends up touring the United States for a full year, 1939 to 1940, leaving the children at home, and they have 1 child born in the United States. Then he returns to Hong Kong with this 3-month-old boy, unfortunately just before the Japanese invasion, which is a complete shock to them. And so here they are. Newborn baby, surprise attack, terrifying for all Chinese born in Hong Kong. And what it means then is 4 years of extreme hardship and poverty. It means keeping your head down because the Japanese army is predisposed to murdering Chinese civilians, full stop. And in fact, that happens to 10,000 in Hong Kong who are massacred before the end of the occupation, most of them en masse. Many more than that are forced to go to China or die of starvation. So this baby grows up in that context, and he recalls later shaking his little fist at Japanese planes from the roof of their house. Now, by the end, the family is traumatized by the war, which shortly after it leaves the father an opium addict, and this little boy, Li Junfang, he becomes a street fighter, a gang member in a triad. Now, because of that, and to avoid his going to jail, which was imminent, his family sends him to America at the age of 18. This is also that he can reclaim his birthright citizenship. He lands in Seattle. He ends up taking studies in drama and in philosophy, and he has a lifelong fascination with philosophy and how it fits with martial arts. And he starts teaching martial arts to other students in local parks. Now, those skills get him noticed by television producers in California, and he moves there in the early 1960s. And in spite of his thick accent, his career mushrooms into more work, including for Warner Brothers Films. He takes on a stage name now, Bruce Lee, and he goes on to become the first global Chinese film star and one of the most influential martial artists in the history of cinema, as you know. So there's one success story, a very improbable one, in a context in which many other Chinese never made it through the war. And estimates are that the Japanese massacred upwards of 20 million Chinese civilians, both in China and in the occupied territories. Millions also, as the Hong Kong story indicated, of famine and disease. Now, Bruce Lee's story is also fascinating because it straddles both sides of the Pacific. It speaks to these long connections between the United States and Asia, and that goes all the way back to the black ships of America that opened Japan to the world, and that continued ever after, and really ramped up in the United States Asian diplomacy that begins with Teddy Roosevelt at the turn of the century. And this is after the United States took the Philippines in war in the Spanish-American War of 1898. Okay? Teddy Roosevelt, not incidentally, fifth cousin to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who will be fighting this, directing this massive war here in World War II. Anyway, America evolved here for a long time. Enough said there. And for a while, the history of the Pacific War. The orthodox interpretation after the war was that, yeah, 100% this was Japan provoked this and they're completely responsible. The good war thesis, right? By the 1960s, though, that starts to change the way this war is written. Okay, and then it becomes more about American imperialism than Japanese. Okay? And that really reflects the fact that this is a period of the massively unpopular war in Vietnam, where a lot was exposed about the U.S. government and how it lied to its own people, and also the bombing of civilians in Cambodia. And so revisionists very negative about current diplomacy start to see a continuity here, and the United States becomes the evil empire. So see that in text from the 1960s. That's really when the historical revisionism happens about the atomic bombing from a historian like Garl Parovitz, who coins that term and says that this is a great symbol of American imperialism, right? Symbol of the conflict, and that bombing was strategically useless, and that its real purpose, in fact, was to establish America as the hegemon in Asia. Okay, atomic diplomacy is it called. And Garl Parovitz first wrote that book in '65. He revises it. He writes basically the same book in 1995. And really that period launched this interpretive contest over the war that has never ended. Okay? Now my task, I want to give you the often ignored backstory from the Japanese side in answer to a couple questions. One of how this war began, right? And all the way up to Pearl Harbor, and also answering the question, why would a relatively weak nation like Japan take on the strongest nation in its perimeter, and the one that would almost certainly put an end to their expansionist plans, or could, right? Also, I want to give you a sense of what those plans were, and also why were the Japanese hell-bent on taking on conquest, and why are they doing it now? Now, if you read back into the historical context of Japan, you start to realize that the Japanese ultimately viewed themselves as this innocent, pure race who also were victims of history, mainly the West, and who, in the context of the 1930s and World War II, have the opportunity to turn that around. And they also believe by this point that everyone around them are racially inferior. Okay, now the Japanese worldview doesn't happen overnight. Okay, so let's do a bit of Japanese history. Okay, Japan is a series of warring states, warring kingdoms up until 1600, when the samurai warriors unite the country, and that begins the Tokugawa shogunate, or the Edo period, named after the capital city, Edo, now Tokyo. Okay, the Tokugawa shogunate, a united country. Now, fascinating, exactly what the Chinese did in the 15th century, the Japanese do now, and they close themselves off from the world. They go into Sokoko, or exclusion, and they make the decision, the Edo rulers, to forbid firearms in order to maintain that samurai code. Okay? The samurai code, which I haven't really got into yet. Anyway, and they kept Europeans off their land, literally. The closest European feet can come to Japan's sacred soil, and by the way, the Europeans are the barbarians. The closest they come is a coastal raft, okay, a raft off the coast, and that was only the Dutch. Okay, so any communication with the outside world was through that. No barbarians could touch their soil under penalty of death. Now, in terms of their worldview, since about the year 1000 or so, they had adopted Buddhism from India, and they had adapted it into Zen Buddhism. Now, with that came the notions of karma and reincarnation, which are super important. Now, a key point about karma is it holds that really your misfortunes in this life are not random, right? They're also not unjust because they're a just repayment for your past life and the sins of that life, right? So that says that people really believe that the world is a just place. It's a fair place. There are no real victims. So if you're weak, you're sick, you're blind, whatever, um, that's on you. And also the one hope for improvement is to be faithful to your position in this life and then hopefully die and come back to a better one. Okay? That means there's always another chance to get to nirvana, and the way to get there is mainly through stoicism and acceptance. Now, if you take that to the level of a civilian or a foot soldier, it's pretty clear the effect that that's going to have, and that means conformism, right? Diminished importance of this life. Now, of course, that can't be a complete explanation of the Japanese worldview any more than the Christian message of turn the other cheek is an explanation of Americans. Clearly, it's not. Every people group have twisted their own face, okay? But there's also something here. Uh, and and there's more. Buddhism explains belief in afterlives and karma. Those definitely have an influence here, as they did in India. Massive influence there. Japan also has Shintoism. Shintoism is unique Japanese, much older ideology, indigenous to Japan. And it is about reverence for nature, for purity, for the ancestral spirits. And it's a sense of loyalty as well to the land, the emperor, and the clan. And what it does is it drills down on how to live this life. And it's also blended with Confucianism, and it really is what spawns the Bushido virtue set, or the so-called samurai code of the Edo period. And that code is delineated in books like the Hagakure, which is a samurai book from the early 1700s. Now, the Hagakure lays out what is Bushido. It's things like honor, loyalty, respect, and courage. Really, in essence, it's about how to die well. Okay? And it tells the warrior they should live as though they are already dead, because, of course, that makes them more willing to die at any moment in service to your lord and master. Okay? Now, Bushido also not a perfect explanation for everything Japanese any more than the Protestant work ethic is for Europeans, but it definitely explains a lot. Explains honor, the warrior ethic, and the fact that Europeans were stunned by how the Japanese nobody feared death less than the Japanese. They famously stated these few Europeans that got to Japan. Anyway, honor, the warrior ethic. There's a long tradition of this that is really hard to understate. Okay, and getting back to politics, Japan in the 19th century context, they are shocked into the modern world by Commodore Perry of the United States, and he is this jowly take no guff commander that you see there in the top of this slide, and who the Japanese commemorate later in a fairly decent woodcut. Anyway, Perry sailed to Edo in a fleet of 4 battleships with a letter from President Fillmore demanding a peace treaty, or sorry, a trade treaty. So this is 1853. Okay? The Japanese demur, and the Americans don't want to press it yet, but they return the following year with 8 ships. And of course, all these ships, the black ships as the Japanese call them, completely outclass the weak Japanese who have spent centuries in isolation, who have not industrialized, zero technology really compared to Europeans and North Americans. They have no choice but to agree. But what that does is it triggers this lost confidence in shogunate and the whole shogun model, which is now called evil customs, even though they never go away. But demands now for a new system, at least of government, for reform and westernization. Right? And it ends in this internal disorder that sees the overthrow of the shogunate, and that is 1868. Okay? Now that ushers in what the Japanese term the Meiji period, which means enlightened rule. Meiji, enlightened rule. And with that, there's a new constitutional monarchy mimicking what the Europeans have, but not quite. It's under the emperor. The emperor had been completely sidelined during the Edo period. Now he has power on par with parliament. Okay? but also not, because there's these elite elder statesmen, the Genro, who have a lot of control behind the scenes as advisors. So Japan is always that kind of awkward in between authoritarianism and democracy right up until the war. But in any case, more than you need to know that this is a time of very intentional modernization, westernization. Uh, but you have this problem from the top of how to maintain national unity and the order that we had in Japan in the Shogun era. So what we see, or this fear that of Japan being disunified, and so what we see is the Meiji oligarchy very deliberately cultivating a couple things. One is the ideology of Yamata Damashi, okay, and that is the idea of the unique Japanese spirit, or a Volksgeist, as the Germans would call it. Now that's been around for a while, but it starts to get emphasized more, and it takes on a racial component where the Japanese are now superior to those around them. Okay, Yamata Damashi. Also, we get this religious revitalization program that links the emperor to the ancient Shinto religion and starts to implements this new veneration of the empire in this state Shinto system, where emperor worship becomes a civic duty, and where you get what you call a cult of the emperor, especially in the Imperial Japanese Army. And with that is the idea that Japan itself is a land and people created by the sun goddess, and especially favored by the ancient gods, and that the emperor, and this is new here, is a direct descendant of that goddess, okay? Amaterasu. Okay? And also, super consequential, that there will be nirvana for all who die in battle for the emperor. Right? So this is a hyper-nationalist ideology, and ultimately it will be expressed in written form in what is called the Kokutai no Hangi of 1937, and that is a statement of the cardinal principles of the nation. Okay, so now let's go to geopolitical perspective, 20th century, because by that point a lot more has happened, and what we see by the 19th century is a growing militarism in Japan, which really coincides with the long decline of China. Now, that's really important from a regional perspective, that China is in this long period of decline in the late Qing or Manchu dynasty. Okay, and along with that too, we have this intense naval buildup in Japan in the early 20th century, which kind of makes sense given the humiliation of the black ships. Now that naval buildup alarms the Americans and the UK, and it leads to negotiations where the Japanese sign these naval treaties with both of them, 1922 and 1930 respectively. And they're both doing that to avoid an arms race, which none of the three want, London, Washington, or Tokyo. And what the Japanese agree is to not build any more Pacific naval bases, at least in the Western Pacific. But this is after Japan has already flexed their muscles, and perhaps I should have started there. And that begins in the 1890s, where they make claims on China, right? This decline in China, and that's 1895. Specifically territorially, they invade and they take Taiwan, okay, which then was called Formosa. I take that from China. 1905, they invade and capture Korea. Now, Korea was a vassal state of China, going back to, I believe, the 9th century. They turn Korea into a puppet state, a Japanese province, essentially. Then they'll use that later as a base to attack northern China's Manchuria province. Now, what we have in the early 20th century, meantime, is a growing influence of the extreme right, and they are called the Kodaha faction, and they're a political branch of the Imperial Japanese Army. Kodaha also means Imperial Way faction. And they are a result of the instability of the 1920s. Okay? Now, the 1920s is a period of major conflicts between the state and the Army and Navy, and one in which the armed forces eventually prevail. And one that kind of mirrors what's happening in Germany post-World War I in the Weimar period, including a lot of parallels. A financial crisis in 1927, like the one in Germany a few years before that, which means a run on the banks. It means inflation and the middle class being completely wiped out. There's also this unfortunate incident of a massive earthquake that does enormous destruction. That feeds into this collapse as well. Anyway, like in Germany, it starts making people, when their finances are wiped out, make them reconsider their allegiances, right? Kodaha is influential enough that like the putsch in Germany that the Nazis tried, they also attempt a coup. That's a bit later there. It's 1936. Okay? But again, parallels. They're newly empowered by the Great Depression, as are all extremists around the world at that time. Now they fail. They end up getting purged from government, but they don't go away. And again, like the Nazis with their legal revolution there, they take over from within. To the point that by 1940, Japan is in their control, is now effectively an authoritarian state. So with these violently racist nationalist pro-war expansionists on the top and in control of the Navy and especially the Army. Um, and yeah, Japan is preconditioned for authoritarian control by the fact also that their modernization campaign was completely unique, as was their government. So here, rather than a Western style of capitalism, they had developed this unique form of industrialization where you have a few family-controlled corporations that dominate much of the economy, right? And the thing about it is they're hard for us to understand because they're not just corporations; they're inextricably linked to the major political parties. In fact, those parties operate as a branch of their corporate interests. And these zaibatsu, as they're called, even do state functions like collecting taxes and running they also run the banking systems. Uh, and it's this tight nexus where the same men who control the army are at the helm of the Mitsui Corporation, and the ones who control the navy are at the helm of the Mitsubishi Corporation. Okay, and though these big four zaibatsu are only really 1/3 of the national economy, they have this outsized influence. And what I'm trying to draw for you here is that Japan is what Eisenhower would later call the military-industrial complex, and they are that to the nth degree. Now, parallel with the ascendancy of the Kodaha faction, 1931, as I said, the Japanese army invaded Manchuria. And then in 1937, to the shock of very few, they invade the rest of China. Now, this puts them on a crash course with all those who have interests in China, including Britain and the US. And what I should have told you earlier with those treaty ports in that map, Europeans since the 19th century have been forcing treaties on China and have these treaty ports inside China where European law obtains, and the Chinese have no power to do anything with that in the context of which they are falling apart in that civil war by the 20th century. Now, so yeah, invading the rest of China, as I said, puts them on a crash course to others like the Americans and Europeans, but it happens in the context of a war that's mainly between the communists and the nationalists in China. Okay? At one point, China even had 3 separate cities claiming to be the national capital. In any case, this Japanese invasion is a brutal war of civilian butchery, and Nanking becomes the ultimate symbol of that because here a hungry and tired and desperate Japanese army attacks a defenseless city where the wealthy and the European elite have evacuated ahead of time, right? And so those who remain are disarmed soldiers and civilians, the poorest of the Chinese here. And we get this just massive butchery. Okay, and the numbers are contested. They run the lows here are like in the 45,000, upwards of 300,000 civilians. That's what some will say. So that it's a wide variety. But the point is, yeah, it's brutal, right? And this is just one example. Okay, the rape of Nanking, which the Japanese will call later the Nanking Incident. Um, one of many. Anyway, and as I said, millions of Chinese will die during the war. Now, on the home front, the Japanese government and Japanese army, they justify all of this as if they are liberators. Okay, they are liberating, just like Hitler. We are liberating the Asians from European control. Okay, and yes, China was subject for a long while now to those European treaty ports. Um, so in that way, there's enough truth that they can build on this, right? And convenience for them. But they also define this as a holy war of the Imperial Heavenly Army. Uh, and they also announced that they're creating a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, as if other Asians are, partners in this. So that is really shallow political cover for their plans for domination. Meanwhile, the Americans and others are trying to use diplomacy on the Japanese, but really to zero effect, partly because the Japanese have quit the League of Nations when it critiqued their invasion of Manchuria in what was called the Manchuria Crisis back in 1931. The Brits are especially concerned because Hong Kong is really attached to China, and it's also, all of that is not far from their colony of Malaya or Singapore, which is a really big regional base here. Now, when the war starts in Europe, it is now Japan's hour. And why is that? And you probably figured that out. It's because all the European colonies are pretty much indefensible now. Okay? Dutch, for sure. The Dutch are completely occupied by the Germans, and they cannot get to or protect the Dutch East Indies, the Netherlands East Indies, today's Indonesia. The British, as you know, are surrounded. They're blockaded pretty effectively by U-boats. They're fighting for their survival, and the French, even worse, they've joined with the Germans. They're collaborating. Now that means their colonies here, French Indochina, today's Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, those are under Vichy control. And importantly, they are now Japan's new ally because the Japanese sign a pact with Hitler in 1940. Okay? They sign what becomes known the tripartite pact. So now it's Italy, Germany, and Japan. Now, in one way, this is really an important moment. In one way, it's a smart move on their part because it's a message to the Americans. And that message is that war with Japan will mean war with Germany as well, okay? So that seems brilliant on the face of it. In reality, though, what happens is it confirms American fears about Japanese intentions, and it shows them as partners with Hitler, and it gets them on a path toward economic sanctions of Japan, treating them more seriously. And yet, a lot of what America does at this point can be parallel to what Chamberlain did in Europe, and that is kind of appeasement, right? Trying to avoid war. And a lot happens on that front in 1940-41. There's lots to look at here about how U.S.-Japan diplomacy fails, and I'll give you a broad outline. Okay? First, what's really important is that Americans decode the Japanese diplomatic cipher. Now, the Japanese have a bunch of ciphers. JN25 is a military one, but there's a diplomatic cipher in which the Japanese are using German Enigma machines. Now, the Americans have a massive code-breaking project called MAGIC. They've got hundreds of men on it, men and women, and they find out by the summer of 1941, because they cracked this code, that Tokyo's plan is to invade southern Indochina, which is really Saigon, Vietnam, right? And that would put them on a path then to take Singapore and Malaya and begin their expansion from there. Now, backstory to French Indochina and these plans is they'd already taken a piece of Indochina next to the Chinese border. That's the Hanoi area, okay, North Vietnam. And they'd done that because supplies were coming through to China here. Okay? Not super significant and not a lot of troops, and the Vichy regime had agreed. But in fact, at this time too, wider point is they are still debating whether to go with a northern attack strategy or a southern attack strategy, or which should come first. And going north, hitting the Soviets, hitting the Russia was the first option for a long time, in a context in which the army had plans for this going way, way back. And perhaps you know that the Russians and the Japanese were at war in 1905, and the Japanese had pretty handily won, defeated them. The payoff for taking Russia in the east, and depending on how far you get, perhaps you would get all the continental resources of eastern Russia, perhaps all the way to the Caucasus. So oil being a big one, right? So why don't they go that way? There's a few things that factor into that decision and favor the southern attack strategy. One is that the Soviets until 1941 were still in a treaty with the Japanese. Okay. Another thing is that the Navy wants to drive south because, and its argument is pretty compelling, we have these vulnerable European colonies that are uniquely vulnerable at this place in time. It's our hour, right? Also, Hitler is pressuring the Japanese to go south because he wants to do maximum damage to the British. And also, perhaps, who knows, he does not want to share in the spoils when he attacks Russia. Now, the Japanese don't know that Hitler will, and had they operated in tandem, perhaps they could have defeated Russia coming in from both ends. But Hitler has not told his new Japanese allies this. And they're not great allies in any case throughout the war. Anyway, Hitler is uber confident that he will take down the Russians in under 2 months, and yeah, he wants the Japanese to threaten the British. So Indochina signals a southern strategy. Okay, that the Japanese have decided in that direction. And sure enough, a couple weeks after the U.S. decoded and learned this, the Japanese occupy southern Indochina, Saigon region, with 125,000 soldiers after the French had agreed to a fraction of that. So it really is an invasion. Now, the American solution at that point, knowing their plans, is to shock the Japanese into reality. Okay, with the really controversial embargo. Okay, it comes along with more than that, and it's more than you think. It's not just a simple oil embargo. In fact, they freeze their considerable assets in the United States, and then they put a cap on the amount of oil that they could buy from the United States. Now, at this time, Japan is completely dependent on these purchases from the west coast of America because they have almost no domestic supplies or production, right? They have a little bit, but they've always been heavily reliant on imports, massively so, actually. And they're that much more desperate now because guess what? Their expanded army is using more oil all the time, right? It's on the rampage. But so there's this oil. It's a limitation on oil, but because there are war hawks in the State Department, and because the Secretary of State Cordell Hull is so busy because the world's on fire with Britain and all the rest, his Undersecretary Dean Acheson and others in the State Department are able to translate that limit into a de facto embargo. Okay? For a few months before FDR realizes that. And when he does, he really can't turn back to a limitation, to a partial embargo without sending the wrong message. Okay, now the result of that really backfires. If the intention was deterrence to get Tokyo to withdraw from Indochina, it really has a kind of the opposite effect because they're now more intent than ever on getting to the Dutch East Indies, which has a really big supply of oil. Okay, now the Dutch East Indies has a lot more. They have rubber, they have tin, they have nickel, they have iron ore, all things an army needs, but they also have a lot of food, agricultural supplies, and interestingly, quinine, which is this anti-malarial medication that is uniquely produced on those islands, so which an army also needs and is a big part of the Pacific Campaign, malaria. Anyway, they're certain now, too, that war with the U.S. is inevitable. And from their point of view, an attack on Pearl Harbor was an essential flanking raid in this war. But what I mean by that is it would be in support, really, of the main objective, which was the conquest of Malaya, Singapore, the Indies, and the Philippines. Also, in this matters too, the Japanese believe the Americans are weak. They believe they're soft, and in fact racially inferior. So they believe they will absolutely negotiate after an attack. Okay? And perhaps not immediately, but certainly after slogging it out on some Pacific islands, and as the body bags start to come home, they will lose their appetite and will negotiate. Now, speaking of negotiation, in this context leading up to Pearl Harbor, Americans are still negotiating with Tokyo right up until the end. And really, until October, there might have been a chance for a deal. Okay, and to complicate things, that is the point at which the somewhat moderate Prime Minister Konoye gets replaced with a hardliner. Okay, and his name is Hideki Tojo. Okay, he will lead the war from this point. And why does that happen? Well, Konoye had agreed to the U.S. demand to withdraw from Indochina in exchange for lifting the oil embargo. Okay, who knows what future plans would have been, but that was the deal. Now, that is a hugely tough concession that Konoye had managed to get from the Japanese Army Command. And they only agreed to withdraw after the conclusion of their war in China. So that is the deal, right? China is not on the table here. Well, the thing is, the U.S. says no to that. Okay, ultimately, anyway. And the Secretary of State and the Secretary of War specifically, they convinced Roosevelt. Roosevelt had thought maybe it was a good deal. They convinced him no. And they counter with no deal until Japan withdraws from China as well. Okay? Now, this is the final offer in the Americans, and it is what's called the Hull Note, the famous Hull Note of November 26th. Okay? But because of all this, Kone is forced to resign, and Tojo takes over simply for having proposed withdrawal from Indochina. Okay? Now, November 26th, Hull Note is a 10-point demand from the United States of what they expect before they lift the embargo and have a treaty with Japan. And it includes the Japanese withdrawing from Indochina and also from China itself. Now, to complicate things further, the Hull Note excluded Manchuria. Okay? A lot of people, a lot of those in Japan and leadership actually didn't know that somehow. But anyway, the Japanese see this as an ultimatum, and they decide on war. Yeah, but yeah, interesting point. After the war, several Japanese leaders said had they known that Manchuria was off the table, they would have kept negotiating. Uh, and yeah, any case, the Japanese maintain the pretense of negotiations. They're negotiating in bad faith at this point because they're now steaming for Pearl Harbor. Okay? And then the plan is take out the American Pacific Fleet, which is the only force that can stop them. So in that way, too, listen to that. It really makes sense to them because why would they take on the only country that could stop them? Exactly because it is the only country that could stop them. So the question actually has the answer within it. Okay? And after that, they would hit the Philippines. They would take out the Americans there under MacArthur, which they end up handily doing. And then they would force the United States to a negotiated acceptance of the Japanese perimeter. Okay, their plans were to go much further. We don't have to get into that. But yeah, Pearl Harbor. No one knew better the dangerous path that Japan was taking at this point than Admiral Yamamoto, who's the head admiral of the Imperial Japanese Navy, who did not want war with the United States. And he famously warned this. He said, quote, "If I am told to fight, I shall run wild for the first 6 months, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year." Okay, so that is a long story of, well, really Japanese worldview, which I believe is super important for understanding the Pacific War, but also the geopolitical context that leads to this conflict. Should answer a lot of questions for you about how it happens and why it happens and why the Japanese make this decision to attack Pearl Harbor, the Day of Infamy, as it's called, where so many American sailors die and where American entry is assured, and also why this battle, much of what I told you, should explain why this battle became such a bloody one. Okay, so that's our lecture up to Pearl Harbor, and we will unpack the rest of that in a later talk. Thanks for listening, and I hope that that was a good one for you. Hope you found it of interest and got a lot out of it. Okay, any questions, 100%, let me know.